They say humanity's story began with fire and ended with light. But the truth is, it never ended at all. In the closing decades of the 22nd century, Earth was dying, not from alien weapons or cosmic storms, but from itself. The air burned, the oceans rose, nations fractured, and then, when the world had nothing left to give, humanity did the one thing it had never done before. It united. They called it the Solar Compact. Not a government, not an empire, a pact, a promise between survivors. No more wars over ashes. It wasn't a utopia. It was held together by necessity, not faith. But it worked. Factories turned from weapons to habitats. Satellites became lifelines. Humanity wasn't pure. It was pragmatic. And in that pragmatism, it found strength. By 2179, the first Alcubierre drives roared to life, bending space-time like wet clay. Humanity looked out into the void and whispered, "Let's see what's out there." But even then, we didn't go as dreamers. Our first starships weren't explorers. They were scouts, armored, armed, and cautious. Because we remembered what it meant to trust too easily. We remembered the predators, both the ones that hunted us and the ones we had become. The Magellan Arc was the first to see it. An object near Proxima Centauri, moving against the stellar drift. Not rock, not ice, metal. What followed would change history. The drone they recovered belonged to the Vraen, a species older, colder, and infinitely more methodical than us. Reptilian strategists whose empires spanned dozens of systems. To them, the galaxy was a puzzle of control. Every race a piece to be fitted, dominated, or discarded. When the Vraen analyzed humanity, they saw disorder. Too many governments. Too many voices. A young, fractured species without hierarchy or discipline. In their eyes, war was not cruelty. It was maintenance. But what the Vraen didn't understand was this. Humanity had been fighting extinction since before it could speak. Our entire history, from sharpened stone to starship steel, was a story of surviving predators. We never learned peace long enough to forget how to fight. So when the Vraen fleets came, we didn't panic. We prepared. Every ship that left orbit carried the same unspoken creed. We do not go to conquer. We go to endure. They said the stars would humble us. They were wrong. The stars would make us dangerous. In time, they would call us unpredictable, reckless, terrifying. But back then, we were just desperate. And desperation, as history would learn, is humanity's deadliest weapon. They played a recording of Earth's retreat. Then she asked, "Do you want audio from our side?" The year was 2219. Humanity had been among the stars for less than a generation. The colonies were young. The fleets were scattered. And the Vraen had finally decided it was time. They called it a frontier correction. We called it an invasion. The first to fall was Epsilon Ridge, a mining colony at the edge of the Gliese frontier. 10,000 people. Gone. Not even a distress signal escaped the flames. When the images reached Earth, silence followed. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. The Solar Compact voted within hours. Every ship, every pilot, every orbital yard capable of producing war material was mobilized. For the first time in centuries, humanity was united under one banner. Not of peace, but of vengeance. But the truth was grim. The Vraen outnumbered us nearly 4-1. Their ships were heavier, their armor thicker, their weapons elegant in their precision. To meet them head-on would be suicide. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. Our early fleets, proud, organized, hopeful, were torn apart. Entire squadrons vanished into plasma fire. Colonies burned under orbital bombardment. And every message from the frontier carried the same desperate plea. We're holding as long as we can. In those days, humanity's hope was a fragile flame in a hurricane. But then, something changed. In the chaos, human commanders began to see patterns. Not in victory, but in defeat. When a fleet was outnumbered. When it had no chance. When logic said to surrender. It ran. And sometimes, the enemy followed. They would chase us into asteroid belts, into debris fields, into the storm zones where sensors failed. And that's when the hunters learned fear. We began to lure them, to fake distress signals, to broadcast false data, to leak energy signatures as if we were dying when we were baiting. At first, it was desperation. Then, it became doctrine. The Vraen called it shadow warfare. We called it survival. Every battle became a lesson in deception, A fleeing human frigate was never just running. A retreating formation was never chaos. It was invitation. And by the time the Vraen realized the truth, by the time they saw that their prey had turned hunter, it was too late. The shift began quietly. A dozen small engagements where retreat became ambush, where weakness became a weapon. And then came the moment that would define everything. The Battle of Red Vector. A task force led by Captain Sarah Chun, aboard the frigate Mongoose, outnumbered 4-1. The mission: delay a pursuing Vraen battle group at the edge of the Orion Spur. Expected outcome: annihilation. But Sarah Chun was not a captain who accepted predictions. She was a strategist, born from the fires of Earth's last wars. Calm, calculating, and beneath it all, burning with something far sharper than fear. She ordered her fleet to simulate panic, to break formation, to leak false power signatures, to broadcast fake distress calls. Every sensor readout screamed collapse. Every transmission told the Vraen, they're running, they're broken. The Vraen pressed the attack. They chased the retreating humans through a debris field. They believed they were witnessing a rout. What they didn't know was that every piece of that debris field had been seeded. Buried among the wreckage were dormant mines, hidden rail platforms disguised as drifting scrap, drone torpedoes awaiting a single command. When the Vraen fleet crossed the threshold, Captain Chun transmitted a single coded phrase. Hotel 7. Close the gate. The stars themselves seemed to ignite. The debris field erupted in kinetic fire and missile storms. From every direction came destruction, silent, coordinated, merciless. Within minutes, the Vraen formation was crippled, their command ships torn apart, their communications shattered. What had begun as a retreat became a massacre. The galaxy would later call it the trap at Red Vector. Humanity called it the day the hunters learned fear. After that, the war began to change. For the first time, the Vraen hesitated. They began to second-guess the patterns they once trusted. Every human signal, every retreat, every silence became suspect. And for the first time in their empire's long history, the predators looked over their shoulders. When the ceasefire came, it wasn't born from mercy. It was born from uncertainty. The Vraen could no longer predict us, and that terrified them more than any weapon ever could. They had learned that when a human fleet runs, you never, ever chase it. I still remember the color of that day. Red, not the color of blood, but the color of warning lights. The glow of overloaded engines. The hue of a dying star bleeding through debris. They called it Red Vector because of the nebular drift. But to us, it became something else. A place where death waited behind every silence. When command told me we were to hold the line against a Vraen fleet 4 times our size, I didn't protest. Orders are orders. But I knew the math. We weren't meant to win. We were meant to delay. Delay and die. But humanity had never been good at dying quietly. I gathered my officers aboard the Mongoose. Half of them were fresh out of the academy. The other half had seen too much already. I told them the truth. We can't win this battle, I said. But we can make them remember us. They didn't cheer. They just nodded. And that was enough. Our fleet numbered 31 ships. Frigates. Gunboats. Supply haulers refitted with whatever weapons we could weld on. Against us, 126 Vraen warships. Perfectly aligned. Perfectly confident. They expected us to flee. So that's exactly what we did. At first, it looked real, because it was. They hit us hard. Our rear guard burned. 3 ships lost in the first exchange. We scattered, our comms filled with screams and static. But beneath the chaos, every movement had purpose. Every mistake was a signal. Every fragment of data was part of a script. We lured them forward, closer, step by step, until they entered the field. To the Vraen, it looked like random wreckage, the aftermath of a forgotten skirmish. But each piece of debris had been positioned with precision. Some carried mines. Others held dormant turrets, jury-rigged railguns powered by stored reactor cores, and hidden within the electromagnetic noise, our waiting drones. When the last Vraen battleship crossed the perimeter, I gave the order. Hold transmission. Await my mark. The bridge went quiet. You could hear the hum of the reactors through the deck plates. Every heartbeat felt like thunder. Then Ensign Karu, barely 19, shaking, turned to me. "Ma'am," she whispered. "They're hailing. They think we're surrendering." I smiled. "Good," I said. "Let them believe it." She hesitated, then asked the question I will never forget. "Captain, Are we really running? I looked at her, at all of them, and said the words that would echo for centuries. Do you want audio from our side? That was the signal. The mongoose pulsed the code, a short, encrypted burst on an old Earth frequency. Hotel 7. Close the gate. The void erupted. Every dormant turret came alive. Every mine detonated. The debris field turned into a cage of fire. Vraen cruisers, confident and orderly, suddenly found themselves blind, their formations collapsing under invisible strikes. Missiles rained from nowhere. Kinetic slugs ripped through their armor. They tried to retreat, but their navigation arrays were jammed. They tried to coordinate, but our false transmissions flooded their channels. For 7 minutes and 23 seconds, the hunters were trapped, and when the silence finally returned, the red vector field was no longer red. It was black. We lost 12 ships that day. Good people. Friends. But the Vraen lost everything. An entire fleet, erased by ghosts they thought were running. Afterward, Command called it a masterpiece of tactical deception. Historians would call it the day the hunters learned fear. But to me, it was just survival. Every victory comes with a ledger of blood. And that day, we wrote in ink so dark that even the stars seemed to dim. When the ceasefire came weeks later, the Vraen requested it first. Not because they pitted us. Because they finally understood. They could predict strength. They could counter numbers. But they could never predict us. Because humanity fights like no other. We fight with fear. With desperation. With memory. When the battle record was later played at the Galactic Academy, the aliens saw panic, confusion, retreat. They thought it was cowardice. Until I stood beside them in that cold lecture hall and asked a simple question. Do you want audio from our side? And when the recording began, they finally heard what war sounds like when survival becomes an art. Centuries passed. The war was over. But the stories remained. Across the stars, the Battle of Red Vector became legend. A lesson. A warning. And, for some, a question that refused to fade. What kind of species fights like that? What kind of mind turns fear into a weapon? In time, the Galactic Concord opened its doors to humanity. Reluctantly, cautiously, but inevitably. They had seen what we could do when cornered. Now they wanted to understand why. That's how Professor Thexler came into the story. Thexler was not a soldier. He was a scholar. A Thalari from a world where war had ended millennia ago. To him, conflict was theory, a puzzle of probability and precision. He studied battle the way a musician studies notes, patterns, structure, harmony. When he invited Captain Sarah Chun to lecture at the Galactic Military Academy, he expected an analysis, a case study, a glimpse into the human mind, dissected and safe. What he got instead was something far more dangerous. The lecture hall was vast. Hundreds of cadets from a dozen species filled the tiers. Glimmering scales, chitinous limbs, eyes that blinked horizontally, all staring at the woman who had changed the course of galactic warfare. Sarah Chun stood quietly at the center, her hair streaked with gray, her uniform simple, unadorned, but her eyes still sharp as plasma. Thexler introduced her with reverence. The architect of Red Vector, he said. The strategist who turned defeat into doctrine. When the applause faded, he activated the holoprojector. The battle replayed in the air. A swarm of glowing vectors, human ships scattering, energy trails twisting through the void. To the cadets, it looked exactly as it had in the archives. A chaotic retreat, a collapse, an inevitable defeat. Thexler paused the image and turned to Sarah. Captain Chun, he said, what were your fleet's psychological conditions during this phase? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She just looked at the frozen hologram. And for a moment, the hall was silent except for the faint hum of the projector. Then she asked quietly, do you have the audio? Thexler blinked, confused. The audio? Yes, she said. The recordings from our side. He hesitated, then gestured. The speakers came alive. At first, it was static. Then voices, human voices. Calm, deliberate, under fire. Orders given with precision, without panic. Tones measured, confident, deadly focused. And then, in the background, the one line that silenced the hall completely. Do you want audio from our side? The same voice that now stood before them. When the final explosion faded, no one spoke. The cadets, even the Vraen among them, just stared. Thexler broke the silence first. I thought this was chaos, he said softly. I thought you were running. Sarah turned to him. We were, she said. Just not from them. The Thalari professor struggled to understand. But this level of deception. You risked your own people's lives on a gamble. On perception. Sarah nodded. That's what survival is. Not certainty. Not honor. Just the willingness to be whatever the moment demands. She looked back at the hologram, the glowing shapes of her fleet in retreat. To you, this looks like panic, she said. To us, it looks like patience. The cadets shifted uneasily. Fexler whispered, almost to himself, patience as a weapon. Sarah smiled. That's the thing about predators, she said. They always assume the prey is running away. They never think it might be leading them somewhere. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was fear, a quiet, dawning understanding that this species, these humans, didn't just fight differently. They thought differently. To them, deception wasn't dishonor. It was instinct, a language older than their tools, a survival code written into their bones. When the lecture ended, Fexler dismissed the class without a word. He followed Sarah into the corridor. For a long time, they walked in silence. Then he said, "You changed the way we see war." Sarah didn't slow her pace. "No," she said. "We reminded you what war really is." Years passed. Worlds rebuilt. Empires expanded and faded again. But the lesson of humanity never did. The Battle of Red Vector became required study at every military academy in the Concord. Not because of the destruction, but because of what it revealed. That victory is not strength. Victory is survival that lasted long enough to be remembered. Professor Fexler Thexer became one of the foremost scholars of human strategy. He published treatises, held conferences, and eventually, his lectures were broadcast across entire systems. And always, he began them the same way. Observe, he would say, and remember, this is not strategy. This is psychology weaponized. He taught that humans had changed warfare forever, not by creating new weapons, but by redefining what it meant to fight. To most species, war was about dominance, about numbers, about measurable strength. To humanity, war was about control. Control of perception, control of timing, control of fear. Where others saw defeat, humans saw opportunity. Where others saw retreat, humans saw allure. And where others saw surrender, humans hid commands. Every action a performance, every signal a potential trap. The Concord called it shadow doctrine. Humans simply called it the art of survival. Centuries after her death, Sarah Chun's writings became required reading across every fleet that might ever face a human vessel. Her final words were engraved into every warship that bore Earth's flag. We do not fight to win. We fight to survive. Victory is the name given to survival that lasts long enough to be recorded. For the Vraen, it became a warning. For others, a religion of fear. And for humanity, a mirror. Because even in peace, they remembered that cunning and cooperation had always been their truest weapons. That the instinct to deceive, to mislead, to endure, wasn't evil. It was evolution. Fexler lived long enough to teach one final class. A lecture given in the same hall where Sarah Chun had once stood. The same recording of Red Vector still hovered before the cadets. The simulated retreat, the sudden silence, the trap. He paused the playback just before the moment of the ambush. The air shimmered with frozen motion. Ships mid-turn, signals flickering. Then he spoke. "Look closely, students," he said. "This is not cowardice. This is patience, precision, and purpose wrapped in chaos." He looked across the room, a mix of species, some old enemies of Earth, some new allies. "What the humans understand," he said softly, "is that war isn't about destroying your opponent. It's about making them destroy themselves." A young Vraen cadet raised a trembling hand. "Professor," she asked, "if we ever face a human fleet again, what should we do?" Fexler thought for a long moment. He remembered Sarah's smile, her voice, and the way she had turned fear into an art form. Finally, he answered. "Pray," he said, "and whatever you do, don't chase them when they run." The hall fell silent, and in that silence, 1,000 generations of instinct shifted. No one spoke. No one moved. Because every being in that room understood the truth. That humanity had not conquered the galaxy with strength, but with something far older. The patience of prey. The cunning of survivors. The unyielding will to endure. And somewhere, in the quiet void beyond the Concord's safe borders, the wrecks of the Vraen fleet still drifted. Silent. Frozen. Monuments to a single, devastating truth. That the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not a predator's hunger, but a survivor's patience. They played a recording of Earth's retreat. Then she asked, "Do you want audio from our side?" The stars remember the answer, and they always will.